The morning it happened was unlike any other in recent royal memory. Across the United Kingdom, from the quiet hills of Balmoral to the bustling streets of London, a strange tension hung in the air. It wasn't the usual buzz of royal gossip or the chatter of morning talk shows dissecting the Duchess's latest fashion choices. This was different. The news broke not with a tabloid headline, but with a formal, unmistakably regal statement. A message that carried both the authority of the monarchy and the finality of history itself. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. At precisely 9 a.m., a short notice was released from Buckingham Palace. Its wording was precise, its tone cold, and its source unambiguous. By order of His Majesty the King, the inheritance privileges previously accorded to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are hereby rescinded. And at the heart of that message, standing firm, resolute, and unapologetic, was Princess Anne. For decades, Princess Anne had been known as the steady pillar of the royal family. The worker, the pragmatist, the one who never flinched under pressure. She was neither driven by fame nor easily swayed by public opinion. So when her voice delivered the declaration that effectively stripped Prince Harry and Meghan Markle of their royal inheritance, it wasn't just a royal formality. It was a thunderclap that echoed through every corner of the kingdom. People stopped what they were doing. Phones buzzed. Newsrooms scrambled. Within minutes, the BBC interrupted programming. Sky News went live, and social media erupted into a storm of disbelief. Was it real? Could Princess Anne, the king's only sister, often described as his moral compass, truly have sanctioned such a harsh move? In the opening moments, confusion ruled the airwaves. Some pundits called it symbolic, others said it was legal, and a few insisted it was merely ceremonial. But those who understood the inner workings of the monarchy knew better. Princess Anne does not act lightly. When she speaks by order of the king, it carries weight. The kind of weight that reshapes royal history. The backdrop to this announcement was already fraught with tension. For months, whispers had circulated of growing unease within the palace. The king, already dealing with health issues and relentless public scrutiny, had found himself repeatedly forced to manage the fallout of his younger son's actions. Interviews, documentaries, and high-profile public appearances by Harry and Meghan had continued to keep the royal rift alive. Each public remark about the monarchy reopened old wounds, and what once seemed like a family feud had evolved into something far deeper. A battle for legacy, identity, and respect. But on this particular morning, the line was drawn. Princess Anne, ever the guardian of royal tradition, had long believed that the institution's survival depended on discipline. Behind closed doors, insiders say she had become increasingly frustrated with what she saw as the Sussexes' disregard for the monarchy's dignity, while others in the family chose silence and had remained steadfast. Her sense of duty, shaped by decades of public service and her mother's example, left little room for sentiment. And when she finally stood before the cameras, her voice calm but unmistakably firm, she delivered words that would change the royal landscape forever. Loyalty to the crown, she said, comes with privilege, but privilege without loyalty cannot stand. His Majesty has therefore determined, in the interest of preserving the integrity of the monarchy, that certain entitlements previously granted to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are to be annulled. It was a statement that struck like lightning, not only for its substance, but for its source. Coming from and it carried the moral authority of someone who had never faltered, never courted headlines, never exploited her position. In that moment, she became the voice of a monarchy reclaiming control over its narrative. A monarchy saying, in essence, enough. Within hours, reaction across Britain was divided and impassioned. Some hailed it as a long-overdue assertion of royal standards. At last, one commentator wrote, "The crown has remembered its backbone." Others saw it as cruel, arguing that the decision deepened an already painful divide between father and son. But whatever side one took, there was no denying the impact. The monarchy had spoken with clarity, and Princess Anne had been its messenger. As journalists dug deeper, more details began to emerge about the days leading up to the announcement. Insiders claimed that and had met privately with King Charles and Prince William in Balmoral the week before. The three were said to have discussed not only the Sussexes' public behavior, but also the long-term perception of the monarchy abroad. For Anne, this was not about revenge. It was about preservation. She reportedly reminded her brother of their mother's words, that the monarchy must always remain above personal grievance. To Anne, Harry's actions, particularly his decision to commercialize royal experiences and speak openly about private matters, had crossed a boundary that could not be ignored. And yet, there was a human tragedy at the center of it all. Because behind the ceremonial language and the palace protocol was a family, a father and son now more distant than ever. Those close to the king described him as visibly distressed but resigned. "It's what had to be done," a palace aide was quoted as saying. The king didn't act out of anger, but out of duty. Princess and made sure he understood that the crown's integrity had to come first. Meanwhile, the public couldn't help but revisit the ghosts of royal history. Comparisons were drawn to Edward VIII, the monarch who abdicated for love and left the royal family fractured for decades. To many, Harry's journey had followed a similar path, from beloved prince to controversial exile. But unlike his great-uncle, Harry hadn't been forced to choose between love and the crown. He had chosen both, and lost the crown's blessing in the process. By midday, the story had consumed every headline. Reporters camped outside Buckingham Palace, while royal commentators speculated about what exactly the inheritance entailed. Though much of the royal family's wealth is protected by trusts and centuries-old arrangements, this decision had symbolic gravity. It meant that Harry and Meghan were not just socially or ceremonially distant from the monarchy. They were, in a formal sense, cut off from the privileges that once defined their royal connection. In pubs, cafes, and households across Britain, people argued over the fairness of it all. Some said the Sussexes had asked for this, that their relentless pursuit of independence had finally backfired. Others, especially younger voices, saw it as proof that the monarchy was incapable of forgiveness. Yet, regardless of opinion, there was a shared understanding. This was a defining moment. The royal family was entering a new era, one where loyalty had boundaries, and consequences were no longer whispered behind closed doors. As the day unfolded, one image stood out on every front page. Princess Anne standing before the royal crest, her expression composed, her eyes steady. There was no triumph in her face, only resolve. She was not there to celebrate someone's downfall, but to protect something she believed in. Those who knew her said it was vintage and a woman who never sought sympathy, who saw emotion as weakness in matters of duty. By evening, as the palace refrained from further comment, the weight of her statement continued to ripple outward. Questions arose. Would this decision affect Harry's children? Would there be a path back to reconciliation? Was this truly the king's will? Or had Anne's influence tipped the balance? None of these questions found immediate answers, but one truth had crystallized. The crown had reasserted itself, and the message was clear. The monarchy's patience had limits. As the sun set over Windsor and the lights of Buckingham Palace glowed against the night sky, the silence outside the gates was almost eerie. The crowd that had gathered earlier in protest or curiosity had mostly dispersed, leaving behind an atmosphere of uneasy calm. A taxi driver passing by muttered, "First time in years I've seen and take the front line. That means something big." He wasn't wrong. For in that single statement, Princess Anne had done what few could. She restored the monarchy's authority in the eyes of some, while hardening its image in the eyes of others. And somewhere, across the Atlantic, Harry and Meghan were learning that even oceans could not shield them from the consequences of defying the institution that made them who they are. By the time the next morning's newspapers hit the stands, the verdict was unanimous. History had turned a page. The royal family had closed ranks. And the woman who had long stood in the background, the one often called the least dramatic royal, had just delivered the most dramatic statement of the modern monarchy. The beginning of this story was a headline, but what followed was a reckoning, a story of loyalty, loss, and legacy, one that would test the meaning of family, duty, and forgiveness in the House of Windsor itself. The morning after Princess Anne's declaration, The United Kingdom woke up to a new reality. For the first time in decades, the monarchy had drawn a line so firm, so irreversible, that even the staunchest royal supporters were stunned into silence. The phrase, "by order of the king," was suddenly on everyone's lips. 3 simple words that carried centuries of power, authority, and the unspoken weight of consequence. Those words weren't just an announcement. They were an act of closure, a royal seal on a chapter that had dragged on far too long. It began in the early hours before the statement reached the public. Inside Buckingham Palace, behind the gilded doors and under the silent watch of portraits depicting monarchs long gone, a private assembly had taken place. It wasn't the full royal council, nor a grand ceremonial meeting. It was smaller, quieter, deliberate. The king had requested privacy. Princess and Prince William and 2 senior palace advisors were present. No aides, no secretaries, no cameras. Only family and duty, and had come prepared. Known for her precision and directness, she brought with her documents, a draft, and notes of every meeting where the Sussex issue had been discussed. While others had chosen restraint over confrontation and had kept meticulous records, every breach, every statement, every public appearance that had weakened the monarchy's credibility. She did not bring emotion into the room. She brought facts. King Charles sat at the head of the long oak table, his face drawn, his eyes tired. He had spent a lifetime managing family crises, some public, others hidden. But this one was different. This time the hurt was personal. His youngest son had not only stepped away from the crown but had spoken of it with disdain, revealing private family conversations to the world, turning royal history into entertainment. The king had endured it quietly, hoping time would heal the wounds, but had lost patience. William sat in silence, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the table. He didn't need to speak. His silence was agreement enough. The responsibility of the future monarchy rested on his shoulders, and he knew the longer this saga dragged on, the more damage it inflicted. The public's faith was fragile, the monarchy's image under siege. Every new interview, every leaked story, every Netflix production that painted the royal family in shades of dysfunction chipped away at the institution's integrity, and finally broke the silence. Her voice was steady, low, and unyielding. "We've allowed this to continue for too long," she said. "It has reached a point where loyalty is no longer expected, it's optional. That cannot stand. The monarchy survives on duty, not sympathy. Harry and Meghan have chosen a different path, and it's time we stop pretending otherwise." Charles looked up at his sister, torn between affection and the painful truth of her words. "And what do you propose, Anne?" he asked quietly. "An end to ambiguity," she replied. "They cannot claim to represent the crown while rejecting it. Their inheritance, their privileges, their connections, all of it must be formally withdrawn. Not as punishment, but as protection. For the crown, for the legacy, for the next generation." Her words hung in the air, heavy but logical. William nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. The king exhaled, the decision settling upon him like the weight of a crown itself. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, slowly, he gave the order that would change everything. "Draft the statement," he said. The rest unfolded with quiet efficiency. By dawn, the communication team had prepared the official release under Anne's supervision. She insisted on phrasing that was neither cruel nor apologetic, but absolute. The line, "by order of His Majesty the King," was her addition, a deliberate echo of the monarchy's ancient voice. It was meant to sound final, authoritative, and dignified. The decision wasn't emotional. It was constitutional. When the statement was released, Anne chose to be the one to read it publicly. It wasn't typical for her to assume such a front-facing role, but in this instance it was necessary. The king's health had become a matter of concern, and public appearances were limited. Moreover, Anne carried a kind of credibility that no one else could match. She was respected not for charm or glamour, but for consistency. Her presence conveyed stability, and that's exactly what the crown needed in this storm. The scene was solemn. The palace forecourt was lined with cameras and reporters, though the announcement itself lasted barely a minute. Anne's tone was calm, measured, almost clinical. There was no trace of malice, no hint of triumph. Her words were sharp as steel and twice as deliberate. "By order of His Majesty the King," she began, pausing only long enough for the silence to settle. "The inheritance privileges previously granted to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are rescinded, effective immediately." A murmur spread through the press corps. Some gasped quietly, others began typing furiously, and continued without emotion, reading the full declaration as if she were delivering a royal decree from another era. She spoke of duty, of loyalty, and of the monarchy's commitment to serve the people of the United Kingdom with dignity. Her final line was as unshakable as her posture. "The crown endures through service, not sentiment." When she turned and walked back toward the palace, no questions were taken. Reporters shouted after her, but didn't break stride. She didn't need to explain herself. The message had been sent. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but resolute. Courtiers exchanged quiet glances, knowing they had just witnessed a moment that would be studied in royal history for years to come. In private, the king thanked his sister, his voice barely audible. "You've done what needed to be done," he said. She simply replied, "It's for the crown, Charles. It always has been." Across the nation, the phrase "by order of the king" became a symbol overnight. It was printed on front pages, flashed across television screens, repeated in endless online debates. For some, it represented strength, the monarchy standing tall after years of turmoil. For others, it was an act of coldness, a family shutting out its own. But beyond the interpretations, there was a universal understanding. The balance of power within the royal family had shifted. What many did not see, however, was the quiet cost behind that public composure. And had not made this decision lightly. She understood the emotional toll it would take, not only on Harry and Meghan, but on the king himself. Yet she also understood something few dared to say out loud, that in moments of weakness, the monarchy must remind the world of its endurance. It was never about individuals. It was about the institution that had outlived wars, abdications, and scandals. The next hours were filled with confusion and speculation. International networks began dissecting every word of Anne's statement. Experts in royal law debated whether inheritance referred to financial assets, symbolic privileges, or both. The palace remained silent, refusing to elaborate. That silence, deliberate and strategic, kept the sense of mystery alive and, in its own way, reinforced the power of the crown. Meanwhile, in the private corridors of Windsor, staff whispered about how the decision would affect Harry and Meghan's children. Would they be excluded from future entitlements? Would their titles be reconsidered next? No one had clear answers, but one thing was certain. This was not a temporary measure. It was permanent. That evening, when Anne returned to her residence at Buckingham Park, she was greeted by the familiar quiet of the countryside. No press, no courtiers, just stillness. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The day had been long, the responsibility immense, but she had done what she believed was right. She knew history would judge her, but she also knew that indecision would have been far worse. For the royal family, "by order of the king," was more than a phrase. It was a declaration of boundaries, a reclaiming of authority. For Anne, it was a reaffirmation of her life's purpose, to serve the crown without fear or favor. And for the public, it was a reminder that even in an age of headlines and social media storms, the monarchy still possessed the power to command silence with a few words spoken from a single podium. As night fell over London, the palace lights burned late into the evening. Somewhere within those walls, the king sat alone, reflecting on what had been set in motion. Outside, the people of Britain debated, argued, speculated. But one thing was beyond dispute. Princess Anne had spoken with the authority of the ages, and the echo of her words, "by order of the king," would not fade quickly. It was not merely a statement. It was a moment of reckoning, an assertion of power that reminded the world that the crown, though bruised, still commanded obedience. and that the quietest royal in the family had just made the loudest declaration of them all. She had spoken for her brother, for her ancestors, and for the legacy of the House of Windsor. And in doing so, she had made clear that the monarchy may forgive, but it never forgets. The ripples of the declaration had barely begun to settle when a new wave of revelations surfaced. What had really led to the king and Princess Anne's decision? While the palace's official statement had been brief, those close to the family hinted at a final trigger that had pushed the monarchy past its limit. It wasn't a scandal in the conventional sense, but an accumulation of smaller acts, each one eroding what and often referred to as the quiet dignity of the crown. And at the center of that chain reaction stood Meghan Markle's recent appearance at Paris Fashion Week. What might have seemed, at first glance, like a routine public engagement for a celebrity couple, was in truth the moment that convinced Princess Anne that the Sussexes could no longer coexist within the royal framework. That event, the Paris spectacle of bright lights, cameras, and high fashion, became the symbolic breaking point. Meghan had arrived in Paris to attend the Balenciaga Women's Wear Spring/Summer 2026 show, dressed head to toe in white, her entourage trailing behind her. For weeks, the press had been whispering about her planned appearance, speculating that this would mark her grand reemergence into the global spotlight. In the days leading up to it, glossy magazines hinted that Vogue might feature her as one of the best dressed of the week, a feature traditionally curated by Anna Wintour herself. The optics, Meghan's team believed, would project power, an image of independence and sophistication far removed from the constraints of royal protocol. But to those inside Buckingham Palace, it signaled something else entirely: defiance. And had been brief days before the Paris event. A confidential report from palace liaisons in France noted the scale of Meghan's security detail, the planned red carpet coverage, and her insistence on being referred to in promotional materials as the Duchess of Sussex. To Anne, this was unacceptable. The couple had voluntarily stepped down from royal duties years prior. They could not claim the privileges of the institution they had renounced while still capitalizing on its global cachet. "You cannot have both," Anne had told a senior aide at the time. "You cannot reject the crown's burden and still wear its crown." The Fashion Week appearance, however, went beyond mere titles. In a private note to the king later leaked to the press, and described it as an orchestrated reclamation of royal glamour under the guise of celebrity. Her phrasing was sharp, and her frustration evident. What infuriated her most wasn't the event itself, but what came after. According to insiders, Meghan's team had allegedly reached out to Vogue requesting that her Paris appearance be featured prominently on their global fashion page. The request was denied. The rumor inside the fashion circuit was that Anna Wintour herself had blocked it. When this story reached royal ears, Anne was livid, not at Wintour, but at the audacity of the attempt. In her mind, this was proof that the Sussexes were determined to exploit every inch of royal association to maintain relevance, even if it meant disregarding the dignity of the crown. Behind the palace walls, the Paris incident triggered an emergency consultation. The king, though reluctant to act, listened carefully as Anne laid out her reasoning. "Charles," she reportedly said, "this isn't about fashion, it's about sovereignty. The moment we allow them to act under the illusion of royal legitimacy, we diminish ourselves. We become background actors in their production." The room had fallen silent after that. Her words, sharp as glass, carried the authority of experience. For Charles, the decision was no longer about sentiment. It had become about preservation. To understand Anne's fury, one must understand her principles. She was raised under a monarch who valued discretion above all things. Queen Elizabeth II had taught her children that the strength of the monarchy lay not in its visibility but in its restraint, and had lived her entire life by that creed. She never courted attention, never sought to be adored. She believed the monarchy's greatest weapon was its silence. Watching Harry and Meghan turn that silence into spectacle was, to her, the ultimate betrayal. The morning after the Paris show, Anne summoned 2 of her private secretaries and began drafting a confidential memorandum for the king's review. It was direct, unemotional, and precise. It outlined the repeated breaches of royal protocol, the public exploitation of titles, and the potential long-term threat such behavior posed to the monarchy's image. The document, known internally as the Paris Memorandum, would later form the backbone of the legal framework behind the inheritance withdrawal. While the king was still reviewing the memorandum, another development reached the palace that solidified his decision. Reports surfaced that Meghan's appearance at Paris Fashion Week had been accompanied by a contractual arrangement involving an international luxury brand. The detail was small but potent. The company had marketed her presence using her full royal styling, the Duchess of Sussex, former senior royal of the British Crown. The use of that title in a commercial context was the final straw. When the king discussed the matter privately with Anne, she said only one thing: "It's gone too far." The simplicity of that statement masked its gravity. And had always been pragmatic. She understood the world had changed, that the monarchy had to adapt. But she also understood that adaptation must never come at the cost of authority. To her, the monarchy was not a brand, it was an inheritance of duty. The moment it became a marketing tool, it ceased to be sacred. Within days, the royal machinery moved into motion. The king's private secretary, with Anne's oversight, began drafting the formal documentation required to rescind the Sussexes' inheritance privileges. It was not a matter of financial punishment but symbolic rectification. Certain royal endowments and associations had remained in Harry's name. Small estates, charitable trusts, and family-linked funds established decades earlier. These were to be dissolved or reabsorbed into the crown estate. The language of the document was careful, rooted in legal tradition, but the implication was clear. Harry and Meghan's formal ties to the monarchy were over. In the public's eye, however, the Paris event had taken on a life of its own. Social media was divided between admiration for Meghan's fashion sense and criticism for what many saw as a tone-deaf attempt to outshine the royals she had left behind. British tabloids ran competing headlines. Meghan's Paris triumph on one side, the Duchess who wouldn't quit on the other. But behind every column inch of speculation, the real decision-making was taking place in the quiet halls of Balmoral and Clarence House. Anne continued to press her brother privately, reminding him that leadership required difficult choices. "It's not vengeance," she said. "It's maintenance. The monarchy must remain inviolate." The king, though weary and saddened, agreed. That night he signed the order. The inheritance was cancelled. The announcement would come within the week. As the story later emerged, the Queen's former confidants recalled a phrase she used during her reign: "The crown must never compete." And that principle had guided every decision she'd ever made. In her mind, Harry and Meghan's actions, turning royal titles into instruments of influence, were precisely the kind of competition her mother had warned against. And so, when she delivered the statement, it was not from a place of anger but of obedience, to her mother's legacy, to her brother's duty, and to the institution they both swore to protect. After the declaration, commentators struggled to interpret the exact scope of inheritance. Some speculated it included the forfeiture of certain private estates once designated for Harry's branch of the family. Others believed it referred to symbolic inheritance, patronages, ceremonial rights, and dynastic privileges. The truth was somewhere in between. The move was as much about message as it was about material consequence. It was a reminder that royalty at its core was not about wealth, it was about belonging. And in Anne's view, the Sussexes had forfeited that belonging long ago. The Paris Fashion Week controversy soon became the narrative shorthand for the entire crisis. It was replayed endlessly on television, dissected on talk shows, and argued about in living rooms. What had once been a glittering appearance became the turning point of a royal reckoning. Every angle of Meghan's outfit was analyzed, every expression interpreted, every silence read as defiance. For the monarchy, perception mattered as much as fact, and perception had declared war on patience. Yet amidst the noise, one image stood out, and seated at her desk the night before the statement, reading over the final draft one last time. The words were plain, deliberate, and free of emotion. She signed her initials at the bottom of the page. Then she placed the document in the red leather folder marked, "The Sovereign's Eyes Only." Outside, the rain tapped softly against the window panes of Buckingham Palace. Duty had been done. By the end of that week, the world understood that a line had been crossed. The fashion show, once meant to celebrate glamour, had become the symbol of overreach. And in the quiet firmness of Princess Anne's decision, Britain witnessed something it hadn't seen in years, the monarchy acting not out of reaction, but restoration. The Paris moment wasn't merely an event. It was the last straw that ended an era of tolerance and began a new chapter of discipline within the royal family. It showed the world that beneath the jewels and pageantry, the crown still had a spine, and it was made, unmistakably, of iron. In the wake of the official announcement, another wave of royal shock began to unfold, not in the palaces or among royal commentators, but in the financial and institutional corridors that once formed the lifeblood of the Sussexes' royal standing. When Princess Anne read the statement on behalf of the king, the phrasing was intentionally restrained, but every word carried a meaning understood by those within the inner circle. Inheritance privileges rescinded was not a ceremonial turn of phrase. It had practical, tangible implications. It meant that centuries of protocol had just been rewritten in the modern era, and for the first time royal financial boundaries were being enforced against one of their own. Inside the Crown Estate offices, the impact was immediate. Teams of legal and financial advisors began reviewing the trust arrangements, grants, and property-linked endowments tied to Prince Harry's line. Most of these provisions had been quietly maintained after his departure from active royal duties, a gesture of grace more than obligation. The late Queen had ensured that the younger son of the king would always have a degree of protection, a safety net of respect and continuity. But that safety net was now gone. The instruction from Buckingham Palace was clear: dissolve, reassign, and reallocate. Everything that bore the Duke and Duchess's names in the context of inheritance was to be reviewed. The first step came quietly. A small trust associated with one of the royal agricultural estates, long linked to Harry since his youth, was dissolved. The land, technically still under the broader control of the Duchy of Cornwall, reverted entirely to the crown. Then came the reassignment of honorary appointments. Patronages linked to heritage and conservation, once granted to Harry during his time as a working royal, were redistributed. The Duke of Edinburgh's old title affiliations, which had informally extended to Harry in anticipation of a continued royal role, were frozen indefinitely. To the public, these were footnotes in a larger drama. But within the royal ecosystem, they represented the erasure of a name from a generational ledger. Royal commentators quickly began to piece together the deeper meaning behind the move. It wasn't about punishment, it was about precedent. For years, critics had accused the monarchy of inconsistency. One set of rules for those who stayed within the fold, another for those who didn't. Princess Anne's intervention changed that narrative. In a single act, she established a principle that the monarchy could no longer afford flexibility where loyalty was absent. It was a return to discipline, one that mirrored the practices of an earlier royal era. And the modern monarchy had bent too far trying to accommodate personalities. The time had come to remind the world that the institution existed above any individual. Privately, the king's senior advisors understood how symbolic this move was for his reign. Charles had long walked a fine line, balancing his desire for a compassionate modern monarchy with his duty to uphold its enduring authority. The revocation of inheritance privileges marked a turning point in that balancing act. It was his first irreversible decision that carried both personal pain and constitutional power. Those close to him said he spent hours in solitude after signing the order, sitting in the quiet of Clarence House, his gaze fixed on the portrait of his mother. To him, this was not just a royal decree. It was a necessary severing, a moment when duty demanded that the father step aside and the king take control. While official documents were being finalized, the public narrative was already spinning out of control. News networks speculated endlessly about what inheritance truly entailed. Did it include financial assets, royal residences, family heirlooms? The palace, maintaining its discipline, refused to clarify. Silence became its most powerful statement. The ambiguity kept the discussion alive but also reinforced the monarchy's dominance over its own narrative. Every unanswered question strengthened the mystique of the crown. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Financial teams were preparing for the ripple effect beyond Britain's borders. Harry and Meghan's ventures in the United States, production deals, branding collaborations, and philanthropic foundations had drawn heavily on their royal status. Though they had established themselves independently, the prestige of their titles had underpinned much of their global influence. The palace's decision, subtle yet decisive, began to cast uncertainty over those endeavors. Partners and sponsors quietly reassessed their relationships. The value of royal association had suddenly become a contested asset. Princess Anne, observing all this from her residence at Gatcombe Park, remained unshaken. She had not sought confrontation but clarity. She saw the chaos not as fallout, but as proof that the decision had been necessary. In her mind, the monarchy had allowed ambiguity to linger too long. To her, this was not cruelty, it was correction. She once remarked to a confidant that the monarchy survives because it knows when to close a chapter. That was exactly what she believed she had done. As the week wore on, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace changed. The usual sense of ceremonial calm gave way to an undertone of control and reorganization. Letters were dispatched, meetings scheduled, and advisors briefed. Every small detail was scrutinized to ensure that no part of the royal financial system remained entangled with the Sussex name. The legal teams ensured that every move complied with existing constitutional frameworks. The tone within the palace was sober, deliberate, and devoid of emotion, just as Anne preferred it. Among the royal staff, the prevailing sentiment was one of inevitability. Those who had served through previous scandals, Diana's departure, the Queen's silent handling of crises, recognized the pattern. The monarchy, when pushed, always found a way to reaffirm its dominance. It did not retaliate loudly. It recalibrated quietly. The difference this time was the presence of Princess Anne at the helm of that recalibration. Her influence was steady, unsentimental, and deeply rooted in her mother's ethos of service. Even those who disagreed with the severity of the move admitted privately that no one else could have executed it with such precision. Public reactions, however, remained polarized. Across Britain, talk shows, editorials, and social media were consumed by debate. Some saw the decision as long overdue, arguing that Harry and Meghan had profited enough from their royal ties. Others viewed it as an act of cruelty, evidence that the monarchy valued image over compassion. But even those who criticized the move couldn't deny the authority with which it had been carried out. The phrase, "by order of the king," echoed through every discussion, as if the weight of history itself had returned to the forefront. In private royal circles, there was quiet acknowledgement that the inheritance issue might not be the end. Advisors speculated about further actions, perhaps a formal adjustment to titles or a redefinition of official precedents at royal events. Nothing had been decided yet, but the tone had changed. The monarchy had rediscovered its appetite for order. The sense of fragility that had hung over the crown in recent years was being replaced by something older, something sterner. Duty, in its purest form, had reasserted itself. For Princess Anne, the reaction of the public mattered less than the stability of the institution. She had not acted to please or punish but to preserve. When she spoke to the king after the dust settled, she offered no congratulations, no sympathy, only a quiet reassurance. This was the right thing to do. The king nodded, knowing that history would remember the act not as a family quarrel but as a royal correction. As days passed, the conversation began to shift from outrage to analysis. Political commentators weighed in on the constitutional implications, noting that Anne's leadership had restored a sense of authority that had been missing from the monarchy's modern image. Editorials in major newspapers began to frame the event as a moment of institutional renewal. Even those who had criticized the royal family in the past began to admit that the clarity of action, though controversial, had restored a sense of purpose. For Harry and Meghan, the financial and symbolic loss was significant, but the larger blow was reputational. The palace's restraint left them with no clear counter-narrative. Every attempt to respond publicly risked sounding defensive against a decree that had been delivered with the weight of law. The power of silence once again proved to be the monarchy's most formidable weapon. In the end, The financial unraveling wasn't merely about numbers or estates. It was about sovereignty, who defines royal identity and who enforces its boundaries. The king had signed the order, but it was and who had defined its spirit. She had reintroduced an old truth into modern Britain, that monarchy, even in the age of media and celebrity, is not a costume one can wear or remove at will. It is a discipline, a covenant, a burden carried by those who understand its weight. As the month drew to a close, the storm began to calm. The decision's consequences were accepted as irreversible. The crown had spoken, and its word was final. In the stillness that followed, the image of Princess and standing before the cameras remained etched in the public mind. No theatrics, no anger, just duty, cold, clear, and resolute. The palace corridors were quiet, the kind of silence that carries both tension and purpose. The statement had been issued, the financial orders set in motion, and yet, the royal family knew that this was only the beginning of the storm. Behind closed doors, they were bracing for the one thing no decree could control, the public reaction of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. For the Duchess of Sussex, news of the inheritance cancellation did not come through a formal letter or official courier. It reached her the same way it reached the rest of the world, through the media. When the first headline flashed across global news networks, Meghan was in Los Angeles, reportedly reviewing notes for an upcoming production meeting. The alert popped up on her phone, followed by a flurry of messages from staff and publicists. At first, she thought it was exaggerated, typical British tabloid spin. But when she saw the footage of Princess and standing before the royal crest, reading the statement in her measured tone, the reality struck her like a wave. Witnesses later described Meghan's reaction as shock mixed with disbelief. Those close to her said she replayed the clip several times, as if searching for nuance, a hidden message, something to suggest that this was all a misunderstanding. But the words were unmistakable. By order of His Majesty the King. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The decision was final and the message was absolute. The royal family had not just distanced itself. They had erased her and Harry's future within the institution entirely. For Harry, the blow was heavier still. Friends close to the Duke said he received the news while in a conference call related to one of his charity projects. The moment he heard, he ended the call abruptly and retreated to a private room. The man who once wore the uniform of the British Army, who had stood beside his grandmother at royal events with pride, now found himself once again at odds with the very family that had defined his existence. Those present described him pacing the room, phone in hand, his voice low but trembling. "She really did it," he said, referring to Anne. "She actually did it." It wasn't anger at first, it was disbelief. Despite everything, some part of Harry had believed that reconciliation was still possible. His relationship with his father had been distant but not entirely severed. There had been letters exchanged, short but cordial. He still held onto the hope that time, and perhaps his father's softer heart, would bring them closer again. But Anne's involvement changed everything. In his mind, her declaration felt not only like a royal decision but like a public humiliation, delivered by the one person in the family known for being immovable. Meghan's reaction soon turned from shock to resolve. Within hours, she was on the phone with her communications advisors, determined to control the narrative before it spiraled beyond reach. "We respond, but not emotionally," she reportedly said. "We remind them who we are." Her team began drafting a statement, one that would emphasize independence and resilience rather than loss. Yet every draft seemed to fall short. How do you respond to a decision framed not as retaliation but as duty? The monarchy's message was untouchable precisely because it was impersonal. It didn't attack. It didn't blame. It simply acted. Across the Atlantic, the media frenzy intensified. In the United States, sympathy flowed toward the Sussexes. Commentators on American morning shows framed the move as a harsh act from an outdated institution. Celebrities and public figures rallied in support, framing Harry and Meghan as victims of royal rigidity. Hashtags in their defense trended within hours. But in Britain, the tone was very different. Many saw the decision as a necessary correction. "The monarchy has rules," one columnist wrote. If you abandon the crown, you abandon what comes with it. The cultural divide across the ocean had never been so stark. Across the Atlantic, the reality of isolation began to sink in for Harry and Meghan. Despite their initial defiance, the long-term consequences of being cut off from royal inheritance were more complex than either of them had anticipated. It wasn't about money, at least not directly. It was about legitimacy. Without the symbolic ties to the monarchy, invitations to certain elite events vanished. Former allies began to distance themselves, wary of offending the palace. Even in Hollywood, where their star had once shone brightest, whispers began to circulate. Were the Sussexes still royal enough to command the fascination that had once defined their brand? At first, their team attempted to counter the narrative through subtle media strategies. Carefully placed interviews emphasized their philanthropic work, their role as global changemakers. Meghan began appearing in op-eds and conferences focused on women's empowerment and social reform. Harry leaned into mental health advocacy and veterans' welfare. Their messaging was consistent. They were more than their titles. But the shadow of Anne's words lingered in every headline. No matter what they achieved, the subtext remained. The monarchy had drawn a line, and they stood firmly outside it. Back in London, that line had become both shield and sword. Royal aides quietly noted the difference in the tone of correspondence coming into the palace. Messages from the public, once filled with criticism, had turned supportive. The idea that the monarchy had finally acted decisively resonated with a weary public. Editorials described and as the enforcer the modern monarchy needed. Even politicians, usually careful not to meddle in royal affairs, hinted privately that her firmness had restored an element of dignity to the institution. Yet, despite her growing public approval, Anne herself felt no triumph. Those close to her described her as reflective, even somber, in the weeks following the announcement. She rarely discussed the decision, but when she did, she spoke of it not as victory, but as responsibility. "It had to be done," she said during one private conversation. "That doesn't make it pleasant." She had never been one for sentiment, but she was not immune to the emotional cost. The monarchy's strength came at the expense of personal peace, and she knew that better than anyone. King Charles, too, felt the toll. He maintained a composed front in public, smiling softly at engagements, addressing audiences with his usual warmth, but those around him noticed the fatigue in his eyes. Late at night, he often revisited his sister's statement, reading it again and again as if searching for comfort in its formality. Some days he felt gratitude for her decisiveness. Other days he felt haunted by the finality of it all. For decades, he had balanced his roles as father and sovereign, trying to reconcile the two. But now, he had learned what every monarch before him eventually discovered. When the crown speaks, family must fall silent. It was during one of those late-night reflections that the king reportedly penned a personal letter to his son. The letter, never intended for public view, was short and sorrowful. In it, he did not defend the decision or justify Anne's role. He simply wrote, "My duty as king must always come before my heart as a father. I hope one day you'll understand why." The letter was sent quietly, without ceremony, through private channels. Whether Harry ever responded remains unknown. Meanwhile, the global press continued to churn. Documentaries, podcasts, and op-eds sought to decode the deeper meaning of the inheritance cancellation. Some viewed it as a symbol of the monarchy's survival instinct in a modern age. Others saw it as evidence of its rigidity. But amidst all the noise, one truth stood out. Princess Anne had become, almost inadvertently, the voice of royal restoration. Her image, once that of a dutiful but distant princess, had transformed into something more formidable. She was the monarchy's conscience, its stabilizing force. Her approach was studied by analysts who marveled at her ability to combine tradition with strategy. Unlike others in the family, she didn't rely on charm or emotion. Her authority stemmed from consistency, the same consistency that had defined her public life for decades. Whether addressing soldiers in uniform or farmers at a country show, Anne had always projected the same tone. Efficient, no-nonsense, utterly reliable. That image now extended beyond her personal reputation. It had become a metaphor for the monarchy itself. As months passed, the conversation shifted from shock to reflection. Public discourse began to revolve around what the decision meant for the institution's future. Many argued that it marked a turning point, a moment when the monarchy reaffirmed its identity not as a relic of the past, but as a living structure capable of enforcing its principles. Others warned that such firmness risked alienating younger generations who valued empathy over authority. Yet even critics admitted one thing: Princess Anne had forced the monarchy to define itself clearly and unapologetically. Within the palace, new protocols began to take shape. The inheritance decision had exposed loopholes in how royal privileges were extended and managed. In response, Anne spearheaded the creation of a working document that would later inform future policies, detailing the criteria for royal representation, financial transparency, and the limits of external partnerships. It was a modernization born from conflict. What began as a family crisis had evolved into institutional reform. Despite the palace's newfound order, there remained one unresolved matter: the possibility of reconciliation. The king, ever the peacemaker at heart, raised the subject with and during a quiet dinner. "Do you think time will heal it?" he asked, and looked at him, expression steady. "Time doesn't heal everything," she said, "but it gives perspective. That might be enough." It was her way of acknowledging the complexity of what they had done. Forgiveness, in her view, was a personal matter. But the monarchy could not afford sentimentality disguised as mercy. Outside the royal bubble, public fascination gradually gave way to acceptance. The story of the inheritance's cancellation became part of a larger narrative, the ongoing evolution of an ancient institution in a modern world. Some saw it as harsh, others as necessary. But for all its controversy, the monarchy had survived the test intact, perhaps even stronger than before. In the end, history would not remember the decision as a punishment but as a pivot. It would mark the moment the crown reasserted its right to define loyalty on its own terms. And at the center of that moment stood Princess Anne, the woman who had reminded Britain that, even in an age of headlines, heritage still spoke louder than noise. The weeks following the inheritance decree brought an eerie calm to Buckingham Palace, a calm that felt both earned and heavy. The frenzy had quieted, the shock had passed, but something fundamental in the royal household had shifted. Conversations in corridors were softer, movements more deliberate. Even the palace staff, usually immune to royal drama, carried themselves with a quiet awareness that they had lived through a historical turning point. What had begun as an administrative decision had become a moral realignment. The message was unmistakable. The monarchy was no longer a family reacting to scandal. It was once again an institution enforcing principle. Princess Anne, ever disciplined, resumed her schedule as though nothing unusual had occurred. In truth, this was how she processed such events, by maintaining order. Her days at Buckingham Park remained predictably structured. Early rides through the misty countryside, followed by briefings, correspondence, and scheduled appearances. To outsiders, her composure appeared unshakable, but those who knew her well understood that her silence was not indifference. It was reflection. She had been raised to measure duty not by emotion but by endurance. Still, there was one thing even she could not deny. She had just redrawn the moral map of the modern monarchy. At the same time, the British press, never content with stillness, began shifting its focus from the Sussex's downfall to Anne's resurgence. Newspaper headlines painted her as the Iron Princess and the silent power behind the crown. Profiles revisited her lifelong service, her decades of charity work, her refusal of titles for her children, her tireless commitment to duty. Analysts contrasted her restraint with the loud celebrity culture that now defined the Sussex brand. It was a narrative and neither sought nor welcomed, but it served a purpose. For the first time in years, the monarchy's story wasn't one of division or scandal. It was one of discipline, decisiveness, and unity. Her role as enforcer had elevated her status not just within the family, but in the public consciousness. The king, though emotionally drained, understood that his sister's decisiveness had spared him a longer humiliation. He began consulting her more frequently, inviting her into discussions traditionally reserved for the monarch's private circle. She didn't advise with sentiment. She advised with logic. "We cannot keep explaining ourselves," she told him during one meeting. "Every time we defend, we weaken. The crown must speak only through its actions." Her words became a quiet creed within the palace, an unofficial mantra of the new royal order. Prince William, too, began to model aspects of Anne's approach. Observing her calm authority, he saw in her a template for the future, a monarchy that commanded respect through restraint, not exposure. Their conversations grew more frequent. In her, he saw the perfect balance of loyalty and leadership. To him, she wasn't merely his aunt. She was the embodiment of what the crown required in a century that no longer revered tradition by instinct. Across the Atlantic, however, the silence of the monarchy only deepened Meghan's frustration. For her, the lack of response was infuriating, a masterclass in power through omission. Every time she tried to steer the conversation in interviews or public appearances, the palace's quiet indifference rendered her words weightless. She began to realize that silence was not passive, it was strategic. The more she spoke, the stronger they appeared. Harry's struggle, however, was far more internal. Friends who saw him during those weeks described a man caught between anger and sorrow. The loss of inheritance had reopened every wound he had tried to close. He spoke often of feeling abandoned, yet he couldn't bring himself to attack his father directly. "He didn't do this," he said to a confidant. And did. It was easier to direct his anger at her, a figure of discipline and duty, than to confront the truth that the decision had come from the king himself. In moments of quiet, he admitted that part of him still respected her. "She believes in something," he once remarked. "Even if it breaks her family, she won't let go of it." Meanwhile, in Britain, the tone of public discourse continued to evolve. The decision had sparked difficult questions about identity, privilege, and purpose. Was the monarchy a family bound by blood or a public institution bound by duty? Had it adapted to modern values or simply reasserted its ancient ones? The questions lingered, but the public's respect for Anne's clarity remained steady. For the first time in years, the royal family's actions were not being interpreted through the lens of scandal, but through the lens of authority. Even international observers began to take note. Political analysts in Europe commented on how Anne's statement had restored a sense of constitutional gravity to the monarchy. In the United States, where royal news was often treated as entertainment, commentators expressed grudging admiration. "She didn't just win the argument," one pundit said. "She ended it." Back inside the palace, Anne's focus turned toward the future. She knew that the inheritance decision, while momentous, was not the end of the crown's challenges. New generations were coming, children raised in a world of transparency, social media, and blurred boundaries. She feared that the allure of fame might one day tempt others to treat royal status as currency rather than calling. "We've closed one chapter," she told a senior aide, "but the next must be written carefully." To that end, she began working quietly with the king's advisors on revising the guidelines for future royal engagements. She wanted clarity about financial independence, the use of royal connections, and the expectations of public service. Her goal was to make sure no successor would ever have to issue another order like the one she had delivered. It was around this time that a remarkable shift occurred in how the public viewed Princess Anne. For decades, she had been admired but not adored, respected for her diligence, overlooked for her quietness. Now, she was being celebrated as the embodiment of the monarchy's endurance. Editorials praised her sense of duty, her refusal to bend to modern vanity, her ability to act when others hesitated. Even young Britons, once cynical about the monarchy, found themselves drawn to her authenticity. "She's not trying to be perfect," one social media user wrote. "She's trying to be right." The sentiment spread, and before long, her approval ratings rivaled those of the late Queen herself. Still, Anne refused to indulge in self-congratulation. When an aide informed her of her newfound popularity, she reportedly waved it off. "Public opinion changes faster than the weather," she said dryly. "Let's see where it stands next week." Her humility, though understated, was genuine. She had acted not for applause but for principle. To her, doing what was right had never required validation. For Harry and Meghan, the passage of time brought neither closure nor redemption. The emotional distance from the monarchy became a professional one. Their attempts to rebrand as global philanthropists continued, but the lack of royal association began to show. Invitations to elite European circles waned. Royal watchers who once chronicled their every move shifted focus elsewhere. They were no longer symbols of rebellion, but reminders of consequence. The very freedom they had fought for had come at the cost of the gravitas they once commanded. And, aware of their struggle, never gloated. In her mind, punishment was never the goal. Restoration was. "The monarchy is not about who's right or wrong," she once said to a family member. "It's about what survives." By the end of that year, the chaos that had defined the royal narrative seemed to have faded. The monarchy, steadied by Anne's discipline and the king's quiet resolve, had entered a new era of stability. The public, fatigued by spectacle, found comfort in the familiar rhythm of royal service and ceremony. The pageantry returned to its rightful place, no longer a backdrop to scandal, but a symbol of continuity. As winter settled over the United Kingdom, the palace prepared for Christmas at Sandringham. The family gathered as they always had, though the absences were felt more deeply than ever. There were fewer chairs at the table, but the sense of unity was stronger. The crown had endured another trial, and this time it had emerged not diminished, but defined. In the quiet of that winter night, as the lights of Sandringham glowed softly against the frost, Princess Anne walked alone through the gardens, her breath visible in the cold air. She paused for a moment, looking toward the main house. Behind those walls, centuries of legacy continued to breathe. For her, that was enough. Duty had been done. Order restored. The monarchy stood not untouched, but unbroken. In the new year, the monarchy moved with a steadiness that felt almost deliberate, as if every step was calculated to project calm and control. Buckingham Palace no longer reacted to headlines. It set the tone. The inheritance decree had drawn a defining line, and that line became a quiet code inside the institution, an understanding that the crown would never again allow ambiguity to blur its identity. What had once been a family navigating modernity was now, unmistakably, a sovereign institution reasserting its order.